Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Hervé, Vice President at CRA. I am very pleased and honored to introduce you fantastic speakers for the next session on digital regulation. So we'll be able to continue the discussion on the DMA. So as you will agree, our speakers do not need long introductions, if any, so I'll try and be brief so that we can focus on the subject matter of our session. Starting from my left, Luis Soria Romero is Acting Chief Economist at DG Comp. Martijn Snoep is the Chairman of the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets. Emilia Fletcher is Professor of Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia. She is also a non-executive director at the CMA and has been highly influential in shaping digital regulation in the UK and Europe. Fiona Scott-Morton needs no introduction. She's the Theodore Nuremberg Professor of Economics at Yale. She also served in 2011-2012 as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economic Analysis within the Antitrust Division of the US DOJ, and of course has contributed greatly to the ongoing debate on how to design effective digital regulation. And Joshua Gans is Professor of Strategic Management at the University of Toronto. He has very varied research interests, but he published abundantly in particular on the nature of technological competition and innovation, regulatory economics, and the economics of AI, on which he has 2 books. So let me start by saying that 2023 was a special year for competition-based regulation. It is the year that the DMA came into force, that the UK DMCC bill got introduced to Parliament at last. And no longer than last week, the EU Data Act got adopted, and it touches on some aspects of competition in cloud services regarding data transfer fees and interoperability. So the DMA in particular is, as you will agree, a landmark legislation. It has been adopted in record time with landslide votes. And as Olivier Garçon said, the design phase is done. So now comes the application phase, which is probably the most important one. And I think that one of the overarching challenge, and that has been in the debate, is when it comes to application, is how to ensure effective rather than formalistic compliance. And what we can see is that there is a lot of learning by doing underway, simply because, a bit like with AI, if you design new tools with very high potential, it doesn't necessarily tell you how they will be used exactly, with what ultimate objective in mind, and also what the long-term full effects will be. And looking ahead even more, an interesting feature of the DMA, in a sense, is that it is this backward-looking ex-ante regulation in that it is largely based on past cases and past experiences. As Olivier said also, it's going to change, right? It's going to adapt. But yet there is this question of how will it tackle, assuming it should, new technologies and what role it could play in a context of technological disruption, if it should play any role, but in this context that might be happening as we speak. So against this backdrop, let me start with a question to you, Luis. Could you sort of, taking a step back, remind us what it is that digital regulation is trying to fix? And key notions are fairness and contestability, but what does it mean in practice from your perspective? And also, while the DMA is more conduct than effect-based, there is this notion of effective compliance, which might ultimately require some kind of measure of effects. So do you think there is a role for economists to play there?
Thanks, Mikael. Thanks, first of all, for the invitations to be joining this panel, which is an honor. It's a pleasure to be here. And also just to say that the opinions or the views that I will share, of course, are just personal. I mean, on your question of what is that we are trying to fix, no? Because, I mean, just to set a little bit the scene, even though we probably all know, we are trying to fix what we see as a situation of entrenched market power, right? And if we think of what are the reasons for this entrenched market power that we see in digital markets, in the hands of large digital platforms, we understand, and I think we have been learning over the years, that there are reasons, there are market characteristics that explain why we see certain market outcomes, and be it the economies of scale, be it network effects, be it the feedback data loops. And at the same time, we also have observed a number of conducts that tend to reinforce the effect of these market characteristics in terms of leading to gaining scale and entrenched market power. And that's basically what we are trying to fix. And precisely because there is the source of the problem that is being identified is not just conduct, it's conduct combined with market characteristics. I think this already tells us that probably an intervention that was exclusively based on competition law, that focuses very much on conduct, would not be sufficient. And that probably a regulatory approach also would make some sense, taking into account what are the characteristics of the market. And this is why probably we need to see, as Olivier was saying before, this complementarity nature between relation between the DMA and competition law. Let me pause here just one moment on what have we achieved through competition law enforcement over the last years. And I think, because I think what the Commission has done, it's been remarkable in terms of antitrust enforcement in digital markets. First, in terms of leading the way in a situation where, I mean, if we go some years ago, there was not that much of a consensus about the need to intervene in digital markets. Now the discussion is about how we intervene. So I think that's a first remarkable result of what the Commission has been doing, leading the way. In the second place, I think it has also the enforcement with, and I'm sure different people will have different opinions about each of the cases and the merits and how have they been run. But there has been a learning process, and there has been a learning process in terms of identifying what are the problems. What are the problems in terms of market characteristics, but also what are the conducts that may be problematic in particular, and we want to do something about them. So that's a second result. And the third is that it has probably evidenced the need for a different type of intervention. And hence, we are trying to fix also this. We are trying to fix the fact that we had a tool that was very effective, that was necessary, that continues to be necessary in the future, but that needed to be complemented by another type of approach, which is this ex-ante regulation based on, some people say the backward-looking regulation, well, based on all that we have learned. And by the way, this question of, because there's always sometimes this feeling that with the digital markets everything is new, and maybe it's not that new, and many of the things we knew them before already. They combine, the factors are combined in a different way, but they are not just new problems. I mean, if we think of the complementarity between competition law and regulation, which is not specific to the digital market, and you can think, for example, in the electricity markets, the question of withholding capacity and the remit, well, that's also a regulatory tool that we have, and that does not exclude then the application of competition law. So what's new about that? Nothing, I would say. Then in the second, related to that, we're saying we try to fix something, and we try to fix something that is related to contestability and fairness. And I think that's important, because what we have seen is that this entrenched market power and the problems associated with it have manifested themselves precisely in this way, with reduced contestability, the inability of these incumbents being challenged. And we know that in the long term, the reduced contestability may lead to poor market outcomes, especially when it comes to incentives to innovate, that again, Olivier was referring to. And then on the question of fairness, which always has this flavor of, if you want, exploitation in the way it is used in the DMA text, this reference to unfair practices, it's also a question of whether it is weakening certain conducts or weakening precisely the incentives of other entrants to try to develop their economic activities, because precisely they will be not able to appropriate the result of what they are innovating. Someone else will appropriate it, because there is a bias towards the ability of appropriating market rents by incumbents. And I think the DMA text is also very, very, very clear in the sense that fairness and contestability can reinforce each other. The lack of contestability allow the application of unfair practices, the unfair practices tend to reinforce this lack of contestability. And when it comes to the relation specifically to incentives to innovate, I think it is important also to go back to a discussion that, again, is not new. This is a discussion between appropriability and contestability. And I think also there, it is important, I mean, if you allow me just to simplify again a little bit, is if we think of intellectual property rights, there is a reason why they are temporary, right? Precisely because after a period of exclusivity, we want contestability. And actually, there is already, I mean, if we think of, for example, regulation that tries to tackle this balance, we can think, for example, of generic products in pharmaceuticals, right? That's an example of a regulation that what allows is precisely access to data. It has a flavor, right, of digital. It's access to data that is proprietary of incumbents with market power so that they can enter and challenge the position of the market incumbent. So again, we have already tested some of these instruments, and we know they work. And we know they work in terms of generating incentives for the incumbent to continue innovating, precisely because it is a threat to its market position. And also because there are more opportunities to succeed when contesting the market position of the incumbent, it also incentivizes those that want to enter to make the effort of entering. Nothing new. And actually, I think in this context of this time is different. I mean, we have seen it in the last weeks. I think that even in the very, very new artificial intelligence segment, incentives and profitability is really what, in the end, are driving the decisions that are being taken. Finally, on the question of conduct-based or effects-based, and I think it's interesting. And again, it has been already cited this morning, and it will be explained more at length by Lindsay McCallum this afternoon. The Commission has published this policy brief in spring about a workable effects-based approach in 102. And at the same time, it is implementing a related regulation that is conduct-based. I mean, is there a dissonance? Well, actually, I would say that it's very reasonable, right? I mean, what we are saying precisely is that we need complementary tools that are clearly distinguishable, that are trying to address different issues, and that while in antitrust it remains advisable that we have a workable effects-based approach that goes case by case at analyzing what are the likely effects of each conduct in each particular context, I think it is also reasonable that what we have learned over the last years is codified in a way that is more effective, that allows us to intervene quicker, faster, because that's what digital markets require us to be able to do. And in that sense, a conduct-based approach doesn't mean, because sometimes there is this feeling that effects-based means economic-based, and conduct-based means non-economic. And I think that's a bit of a problem there, because that's just not true. The rules, even if they are designed ex ante, and anyone that works in regulatory economics knows that, the rules are based on economics. And their application can still be based in economics, even if the effects are not being put into question every time, because we already know what are the effects in most of these cases. Does it mean that there will be a role for economists? Yes, there will be a role for economists, because conducts continue to be very complicated and very complex to characterize. The last parallelism, just again to insist on the fact that digital maybe is not that different as sometimes people try to think. If we look at one of the last successes of the Commission in antitrust, which has been the decision of the General Court on the Cephalon case, you will see is a decision where the court goes into assessing not just by object but also by effect, and confirms both the findings by object and the findings by effect of the Commission. If you look at the decision and you look at the court judgment, what you will see is that the longest part is the by object, and the part that has more economic assessment is by object. And why is that? It's because sometimes companies can go at great length in making sophisticated conducts that are very difficult to assess. And in the assessment of the conduct itself, in the assessment of the characterization of the conduct itself, we need a lot of economics, a lot of financial analysis, a lot of... and this means understanding what the conduct is, understanding how the conduct resembles or not the do's and don'ts of the DMA, whether it is a circumvention or not, without necessarily going into case-by-case assessment of the effects, but just doing a lot of economic assessment to understand what's going on in that market and what is this conduct really by nature. So I leave it here. I guess there will be time to continue a bit later.
Thank you, Luis. So moving on to Martijn, as a national enforcers, do you have insights on first experiences, and do they look promising to you? Do you see many business users trying to get in, and if not, why? And also interested in your view on the need to coordinate across agencies and maybe more broadly with third parties, data scientists, academics, technologists.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for CRA for inviting me. I feel a little bit like an economist in the early 90s. For those of you who started their practice early ago, I think at the time in the early 90s and late 80s, conferences on competition policy were dominated by lawyers. And then at some point in time, people thought, well, maybe we need an economist. So on every panel, you had a token economist on the panel because we need one. Now I feel probably a little bit like you, Damien. I'm the token lawyer on a panel dominated by economists. So I have to be careful a little bit. But I thought what would be interesting to give you a little bit of a perspective is, first of all, the perspective of someone with a legal background, former private practitioner, and also head of an NCA, because I think it adds to the mixture. And from that experience, I think, I fully agree that the DMA is not there because of a failure of antitrust. But I think at the same time, we have to acknowledge that traditional antitrust enforcement had its shortcomings. Its effect-based approach in traditional antitrust is a great development, and avoided over-enforcement. But at the same time, we have to recognize that an effects-based approach is time-consuming, and it's difficult as an active incentive to change business practices, because it does not immediately incentivize companies to change their business practices. And I know this also from my experience in private practice, discussing with companies with a dominant position, whether to change or not to change their business practices. In light of this kind of more economic approach, a lot of companies had a wait-and-see approach. We'll continue with the practice until we get a complaint or until there is any enforcement action, and then let's take it from there. And I think this specifically is the added value of the DMA. The DMA, and that's how we need to implement it, will create more spontaneous compliance, or the self-execution mechanism in the DMA is what will set it apart from traditional antitrust enforcement. Of course, we're entering this phase now. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We have to see whether it works as it was designed. But this is the important extra element that the DMA will bring, that the important element of ex-ante compliance with the DMA, in particular in light of its most important goal is promoting contestability. Because, like Olivier was saying, what we do need in many of these digital markets is more innovation through lower barriers to entry, through contestability, in order to make digital markets work better for people and businesses. And for that to work, and then I'm coming back to your question, we need ambitious entrepreneurs. We need businesses knocking on our doors, trying to get access, or actually knocking on the doors of the gatekeepers, trying to get access, trying to get interoperability, or make use of any of the other obligations under the DMA. So far, the experience is mixed. I think then I cannot speak for everyone involved in the enforcement of the DMA, but if we look at the number of people knocking on our door at the ACM, there are a few. And some of them are the usual suspects who do a tour, we know, among all the NCAs and the European Commission. But there are relatively few new niche players that want to make use of the DMA. Why is that? We don't know yet. It's too early to tell. But it is something that particularly the NCAs, the National Competition Authority, should be aware of. One theory is that these small players are afraid to get lost in some endless fight that will take forever and that will cost them a lot of money. Another reason could be that they are afraid for retaliation by the gatekeepers in some markets, because there is a dependency not only on this part, but there could also be a dependency on other services that are being provided by the gatekeepers. It could also be, and that's also something that we hear, it's sheer ignorance. They just don't know what the DMA is going to bring to them, or skepticism about whether they will effectively be protected by the authorities involved in enforcement of the DMA. But this is it's a worrying sign. It's not to get worried sick yet, but it is something that we have to take into account, and that is why the European Competition Network, the ECN, jointly decided that this is a theme that we need to pick up. And that's why before, probably in the second quarter of 2024, we will organize a big conference for business users, which will demonstrate the kind of the possibilities and the options for business users that the DMA will bring. It is a conference that should inspire business users, that should inform them, and that should show them the way to either the national competition authorities involved in enforcing the DMA or directly to the European Commission. And with that, we hope to take kind of first steps and also amplify the role of the national competition authorities together in this network with the European Commission in making the DMA a success for Europe. There's one final point that I would like to address, and that also relates to the relationship between the competition, between the DMA, antitrust enforcement and merger control, and the coordination between the national competition authorities and the European Commission. And that relates to mergers. I think one of the things that we have to be extremely careful is that the mergers between gatekeepers and nascent competitors, smaller competitors, new entrants, is going to smother the innovation that we actually are seeking at the moment. And that's why we are very happy with the reporting obligation under the DMA for new acquisitions, combined with the kind of the new approach towards the workings of the Dutch clause and the referral mechanism for mergers below the threshold, below the European or the national thresholds to the European Commission. I think that mechanism is extremely important to keep markets competitive and to avoid that merger control smothers the innovation that we're actually seeking as a result of the DMA. So this is how you see that from traditional antitrust enforcement to the DMA to merger control, there is a policy development that is important to drive further innovation in Europe in these digital markets, and that is a project in which the European competition authorities and the European Competition Network are working together to make this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's going to be interesting to go back to. We've talked a lot about complementarity and go back to this notion in the context of merger and control for non-horizontal mergers that raise concerns for practices that are to be covered by the DMA, and I'm not talking about nascent competitors, but more practices outside of that, and if it is to be tackled by the DMA, how does it work with merger control, and whether we need the complementarity in the same way for something like that. But let's see if we have time for this at the end. So first, turning to you, Emilia. The UK approach has been commented as being a bit different and perceived as more capable of dealing with underlying business models and incentives, but being more flexible. As it is more flexible, but being more flexible also comes with its own challenges. So do you think that there is a sweet spot? And I know there was a lot of debate recently with the UK government on which direction the DMCC was taking. And secondly, you've written a lot about online choice architecture in relation to the DMA. So it will be very interesting to hear your thoughts about the role of a behavioral economist in that context. And just a quick word, we often associate economic analysis as being very complex, but also very simple tools that firms use, such as A/B tests, that can be very quick to use and quite powerful as evidentiary basis. So it doesn't always have to be these complex models trying to model the entire world. Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to CRA for inviting me as well. I should just emphasise that I'm speaking my academic role, not for the CMA. Of course, my CMA colleague Sarah Cardell and Mike Walker will be speaking later. So to answer the questions, yes, the UK regime is going through Parliament at the moment, and we expect there are all sorts of suggestions being made, but we expect a bill, an act to come out of this over the course of the next few months to be ready next year. And actually I would emphasise that I would expect there to be a huge amount of alignment between the UK and EU regimes. Actually, they both address the same issues that we've heard all about, and although we don't have precise details of the UK regime yet, they're likely to do so with a range of really very broadly similar tools. So yes, it's true though that formally the UK is taking a somewhat different approach to the EU. So in the EU DMA that you all know very implementability, I think, has been given great weight. So designation is primarily based on quantitative criteria. The rules are set out in the legislation. They apply across all relevant firms. There is very little potential for firms to get out of those rules applying to them by making arguments, and certainly not efficiency arguments. And the intention behind that setup is that the DMA should deliver its objectives and providing real clarity so everyone knows what the rules are, and also workability. It's relatively easy to enforce. So how does the UK differ? Under the UK Digital Markets and Competition and Consumer Bill for the moment, Act hopefully soon, designation will require the CMA as the digital regulator to demonstrate entrenched market power. It will be up to the CMA to put in place the rules. They aren't in the legislation. And in the context of enforcing those rules, firms can potentially draw on a customer benefits defence. So it is a rather different framework. In setting the rules, the CMA does have a fair amount of flexibility, albeit there are a number of checks and balances within the legislation, and some of the recent debates around the legislation have been exactly how strong those checks and balances should be. Obviously, if you make them too strong, you potentially undermine the whole thing and make it unworkable. So, but getting the sweet spot is I think we're there, and I think it's going to be about right to have the checks and balances that allow the flexibility, while ensuring that flexibility is used in a responsible, reasonable, and proportionate manner. And that flexibility will then enable the CMA to develop rules that are bespoke for each platform, as effective as possible, so far as possible avoid unintended side effects, all based on the available evidence that they are in the process of collecting and will be continuing to collect, and the available evidence. So why are the UK and EU taking these somewhat different, at least formally, approaches? And I think to understand that, it's worth thinking back to why we have these new laws in the first place. And that is partly, as Martin described really beautifully, because standard competition law turned out not to be the right tool for providing a framework for competition and innovation in these critical digital platform markets. And that in turn is partly because competition cases ended up being very hard to bring, huge resources involved in developing economic evidence that really stands up to the high standard that's required in court, and actually Olivier referred to that standard, in terms of really showing likely harm in every single specific case. The benefit of that, which we all know, is it really makes sure we really know that every case really stands up. We minimize the false positives, the over-enforcement. But there is a real minus, and that is that there's a real risk it generates a load of false negatives instead. Lots of cases never get taken because it would be either impossible or incredibly resource intensive to prove them to the required standard. And even for those digital platform cases that do get taken, we don't get the clear precedent and we don't get the deterrence coming out of those cases because, as Martin brought out really clearly, every case then depends on very specific facts. And that lack of precedent and lack of really just means that competition law isn't providing the clear and effective guardrails that we really need to generate competition and innovation in this area. So a key underpinning aim of the new regulation is to provide a framework that, unlike competition law, does both provide clear, upfront, and workable on an ongoing basis for, laws. And so then the question is how far you go along this road of clarity and workability. And I think that's really where reasonable minds can differ. The EU decided to go quite a long way along that road. So with the DMA, all the hard thinking is done up front, learning from past antitrust cases. Yes, lots of economic thinking has gone in there. And generating a set of upfront laws that can be easily enforced. What we know is that that does generate a risk of some false positives, so interventions that are either unnecessary or potentially even harmful, and also false negatives, things that are going to be missed, at least from a competition law perspective. But those are costs, but they are costs that are worth bearing in order to have a clear and workable regime. And I think that is a totally respectable approach. But the UK, equally respectable, is seeking to try and just, I think, lie somewhere between the two poles of competition law and a kind of very rules-based approach. And they're trying to find that sweet spot by taking extra time, building additional evidence, hoping to reach a somewhat more nuanced and flexible balance between the false positives and the false negatives. The real minus is that's definitely going to take time. So the CMA is going to take more time and resources to get the designations and the conduct requirements in place. By contrast, the EU DMA is getting up and running incredibly quickly. But once the rules are in place, I am very hopeful that the UK regime will be just as clear and just as easily enforceable as the EU DMA. And does this mean that in practice the regulations will end up looking very different? I really don't think that the actual rules are going to be that different. They're going to be broadly coherent. I mean, actually, one thing is the EU isn't quite as far along the spectrum as I think they might have expected to be. As Olivier described earlier, there are a whole bunch of areas where actually the DG Comp is working to give greater clarification because it's not quite as clear up front as might have been expected. But I also think, and Olivier also highlighted, that the regime, even the EU regime, will change over time. Both the EU and the UK regimes are going to be watching and learning from each other, and I think that's going to be a very positive process, and I think it will help ensure that broad coherence, and certainly I think both regimes understand the huge benefits of regulatory coherence for really providing an effective global framework for competition and innovation, remembering that obviously not only the gatekeepers, but also the innovative competitors that we're really hoping will succeed as a result of these regulations, they all work on a global basis. And so dealing with globally consistent or at least coherent regulations is going to be important. Just to very quickly answer your question about behavioural economics, and I promise I'll do this very quickly. Just to say, I think that behavioural economics will play a huge role in the enforcement of the DMA. It underpins a number of the provisions in the first place, especially those relating to default settings, easy switching, self-preferencing in ranking. But I also think that many of the DMA provisions are only actually going to be effective, and remember that effectiveness is a very key part of the DMA, if the choices are presented to users in a suitable way. So in order for firms to comply effectively, I think they are going to need to think very carefully about their choice architecture and actually demonstrate that they have thought very hard about their choice architecture. And I think that is going to bring in all of the empirical techniques of behavioural economics, including the A/B testing that was referred to earlier. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amelia. Moving on to Fiona. So there has been quite a bit of discussion, quite a lot even, of discussion on whether the ambitions of the DMA could be achieved with the existing business models of platforms and their incentives. What's your view on this? And secondly, I think this is all related to the question of how to measure success. I mean, going back to the first panel, there are concerns about raising prices or raising markups instead. So if you were to pick one metric, which one would it be? Price, concentration, innovation, choice? And if we think of entry, is it about the quantity of entry or also the type of entry that we want to see?
Those are a lot of questions. Thank you. I want to just follow up on Amelia for a minute, comparing the EU and the UK approaches. I think one way, for those of you who are less familiar with the DMA than the people on this panel, the way you might think about it is the DMA has about 22 rules, put those down the side, then put your platforms across the top, 20 of them, and that gives you all the cells of this matrix, okay? The DMA, in theory, applies to every single cell in the matrix, but of course, some of those rules were not actually designed for some of those platforms. So there's a lot of zeros, or where you want there to be a zero. And the question with the DMA is, are you going to get the zeros in all the places where you want a zero? Because otherwise you have unintended consequences. And we're all watching to see if the zeros are turning up in the right spot. Now, the UK, on the other hand, is going to make up specific rules for each of the specific platforms that they decide to regulate. That's much harder, and well, it's hard to make 22 rules also. So let me just say that it's different kind of hard. And it gives the competition authority an enormous amount of power because they are choosing who they're going to regulate and how to regulate on a day-to-day basis. Let me just say, you have to be a really good competition authority to pull that off. One advantage of not being employed by a competition authority right now is I can give some opinions about that. I would say that the CMA is very good, and I would not recommend this approach for other countries. I'll just stop there because I think it's hard. Okay, so turning to the business models, will new business models arise? I think absolutely yes. What the DMA does is it provides some new capabilities to business users, as well as giving them a greater chance to earn profit rather than having that profit be captured by the platform, and also reduces risk in the sense that they have rights to that interface with the platform. So if you were to build a business on the basis of a platform under the DMA, it can't be taken away by the platform in an arbitrary fashion. So when we see incentive and ability and less risk, we're going to see entry and innovation. Who are those entrants going to be? I think an underappreciated type of entrant are other gatekeepers. We can imagine Amazon trying handsets again. We can imagine Meta doing more in e-commerce. We can imagine Microsoft entering an app store. There's a whole variety of gatekeepers entering against other gatekeepers, as well as businesses we have heard of and are familiar with, like Spotify or Epic Games, as well as entrepreneurs we have not heard of yet. But let me stress that it takes a lot of capabilities to enter successfully in a lot of these spaces, and the littler you are, the harder it's going to be. So I think we shouldn't overweight the kind of expectation that there will be suddenly thousands of little firms. So what does the DMA do? It establishes, as I said, a regulated interface where that business user can function and where there's less ability for the gatekeeper to manipulate or change that interface to benefit themselves. What do we expect to see? Olivier mentioned a couple. One would be new app stores. So currently at the moment, I have an Apple device. There is some guy in Cupertino who controls what my App Store experience is. I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying guy. I'm sorry about that, but I suspect I'm right. And so what is it? It's one generic space that has just everything in it. And 99.5% of those apps I'm not interested in at all. But yet they're in the App Store, and when I search for something, I don't get the thing that I'm searching for. I get something that people put ads on. So what might we see instead? Well, we might see different curation models. For example, perhaps an app store that has in it apps that help you lower your carbon footprint. So instead of 16 scooter apps, there'll be the one that is the best on carbon, or food delivery that's the best on carbon, or a bank, or a restaurant, or a hotel that's good on carbon. So I might want that to be my default app store, and I go there unless there's something I want that's more mainstream, and then I go to the big app store. Or what about an app store for American Express card holders that has all apps for rich people? I mentioned this in this audience because I think it might be a good fit. We could have everything paid for by your American Express card, and all the apps for rich people would be in a convenient spot, and they could all market to the rich people. And this is very consistent with American Express's business model, so we could have that. We could also have apps that do something more technologically interesting, like Epic wants to have a metaverse. Or you could imagine gaming app stores that do more interesting things with gaming. So there's a variety of things that we could get in the App Store area. Then, of course, there are the apps themselves. If I now have more ability to access this interface without the gatekeeper excluding me if I do something that threatens them, then we expect apps to do some of that additional innovation. So you could imagine Spotify branching out into other things. You could imagine payment app banks and payments making more use of the wallet and the NFC chip. We should see innovation in that area. I think we should also see new advertising businesses arising because users will have the right to have a flow of their personal data coming from gatekeeper platforms. So I might be able to get a lower price on my Netflix subscription by authorizing both Google and Amazon to take my search data and deliver it to Netflix so they can make personalized ads for me to see when I watch television. So if I've been searching for brown shoes, then Amazon knows that, Google knows that, and they can have a flow out that I authorize in exchange for some benefit that I get from the place that I'm sending that data. So we could see new advertising models arise. We also may see new OEM models because the OEM now can have more control over the design of the handset and doesn't perhaps need to make it exactly the way Google had in mind. And so we might get more entry in search, for example. But there's a limit to how much all this innovation can be revolutionary because remember, we're working with a regulated interface. So those business users can't change that interface. They can't do something completely different because they are working with what's there. Okay, Michaela asked me what counts as success. I think here we have an interesting debate going on in Brussels, which is, on the one hand, I'll exaggerate a little bit, the gatekeepers saying, well, all we have to do is comply. This is not a rule about any outcomes happening, so we'll comply, and because our products are marvelous, people will continue to use our products, and there will be no change in market shares or entry or anything, because we're already really good at innovation and really good at everything, and so nothing will change. I think that's a little bit unrealistic for a couple of reasons. One, the purpose of this law and the reason the Parliament passed this law is because they thought change was needed. So you don't spend a lot of time passing a law if nobody's interested in it. Secondly, we know there are business users that are very interested. So I think the thought experiment might be, well, if the gatekeeper has complied fully and effectively, and there's a lot of desire by the business user, and the law is opening up an interface that's of interest, we ought to see some actual impact in the marketplace. We ought to see entry, we ought to see change in shares, we ought to see new businesses arising. So if that doesn't happen, I would say probably the first place with that model in mind I would go to is compliance is perhaps not fully happening correctly and effectively. Secondly, maybe the law is badly drafted and the way that the gatekeeper needs to comply doesn't in fact allow for a new business, and that would be too bad. And then I think that would start the process, as Olivier mentioned, of amending the law to fix it so that the businesses could occur. Okay, I'll just say two more things. One is quickly access pricing. Sometimes this comes up. Should the gatekeeper somehow be paid for this interface? The DMA all over it says no charge, so I don't really think this is a debate, but it is interesting to think intellectually about why 0 is the right number. And first, the first thing you might observe is that most of these gatekeepers have been found to have violated the antitrust laws, one way or another. So if you violated the antitrust laws and got a lot of market power and made a lot of profit, I think the right answer is not then everyone has to pay you to access your platform. That doesn't seem fair. Then when you think about the purpose of the law, it's contestability and fairness. So if those are the goals, then if I have an app on the platform and you're the gatekeeper and you have an app on the platform, then for our apps to be contestable with one another and fair on a level playing field, I can't be paying. Otherwise, we are just setting up a not fair, not contestable situation. Third, marginal cost is 0. Fourth, as Louise already mentioned, these APIs already exist, the innovation has been done, the thing has been built, and so we might imagine that kind of like in our intellectual property laws, at some point the royalty goes to 0. The last thing then I wanted to build on is just something that Martin said and Olivier said also, actually everyone's saying it, but it's just really important. Enforcement of the Digital Markets Act depends on business users coming forward. The definition of compliance is effective compliance. What does effective mean? This is not a law with a list of technical specifications. You must build this way and that way. No, it's clever in that it doesn't do that because technology moves too fast. So what does effective mean? It means the business user can use it. If there's no business user explaining that they can't use it, there is not a way for the Commission to say that something is ineffective. So if the business users all sit back and wait for the Commission to deliver them the perfect interface, that's not going to work. Somebody has to be in there saying, it's not effective, we can't use it. If business users all sit back and say, well, we're not going to invest in figuring out our new business until there is a secure interface for us to use, that's not going to work either. So it's a chicken and egg, and if the business users are not stepping up, then we're not going to see the kind of change that we need to see. And that's my top concern at the moment.
Thank you very much, Fiona. So looking ahead, I'd like to bring Joshua in here. So going back to this backward-looking feature of the DMA that might work very well for well-known markets and technologies because we've built all this knowledge. What about new ones? And difficult not to think of AI. And, you know, there is a tension that you raised also, Joshua, at a high level that we can see between what antitrust generally aims to do, namely accelerate adoption of new technologies, and the idea that certain new technologies need to be contained somewhat because of some risks. So what's your take on this?
So thank you for having me here. This is actually probably my 10th time I've come to this conference. I'm also looking very much forward to the, in light of Fiona's comments, the European Competition Authority's first press release regarding the App Store for rich people. That will be quite a moment.
Listen, that's how you get policy to change, when the rich people want something.
So for the past 10 years or so, I've been researching on the economics of artificial intelligence. That was even before artificial intelligence was something most people had heard about. And that research was spurred on by a startup program we had that I've literally seen hundreds of AI startups coming through. So I'm quite familiar with the constraints of small businesses, small business innovators in these new technology environments. So when I listen to the discussions here, it strikes me very much that there's, for want of a better term, a mess of contradictions going on with regard to European competition and regulation policies towards new technologies. You know, on the one hand, you've got the DMA, of which the Director General said, the primary thing that you're interested in is accelerating innovation, which is exactly the laudable goal we want from competition policy, and I used to think from all policy. But with regard to artificial intelligence, and some may be aware of this, others not, but I've spent a lot of time on this in the last year, the premise that we want more innovation is not at all accepted. Very straightforwardly, there are many, many people who are concerned about the pace of development in artificial intelligence and would like to see it slow down and in some places not happen at all. And this is not just simply about, you know, Terminator-style risks, although that comes up more than you'd like. It's about all the other, you know, things that artificial intelligence could be doing because it seems very powerful. It's not very well understood. And the reason why it's not very well understood, by the way, is because it's an advance in computational statistics, and no one likes to more reduce their understanding of things than people's reactions towards statistics. So, you know, we have the European AI Act that is currently being negotiated, and that act is very much, you know, has a lot of. You can see where it's coming from. It's not, you know, crazy by any means, but it's a powerful ex-ante regulation, specifying a number of areas which are going to be required of increased compliance. Does that sound familiar? That sounds like the DMA. But instead of being at a company level, it's at a product level, which, as you can imagine, is a difficult thing to assess, and is not going to be, it's going to be far more difficult to assess when it comes to the small entrepreneurial innovators that we're really interested in here. And, you know, it's one thing to think about providing incentives for those firms to develop new technologies. But my experience, the bigger hindrance to that is costs. Costs are the hindrance. Costs are the friction that slow down innovation by entrepreneurial firms. And what I see with the EU AI Act is potentially a lump of cost. So that's sort of pulling against innovation. Well, we have the DMA that, at least in some of its aspects, is designed to promote innovation, opening up new markets and other things, especially where there are gatekeepers, to allow smaller firms to access the resources they need to be able to provide the sort of diversity that Fiona was talking about. And AI is no exception to that, especially with regard to access to data in particular, and sometimes it might be with access to certain services with cloud-based GPU chips and things like that that may be there. But I fear that it is exactly the constraint that Fiona was worried about. Are we going to see the businesses come forward to push this act into usefulness? And the answer my prior, is we're not going to see any of that. I know that's sad to hear, but mainly because these startup firms have plenty of things to worry about, let alone having their business model depend on their success in a regulatory environment, no matter how streamlined, in order to get the funding for that. Where the DMA is going to have a positive effect, however, is where the startup says, well, such and such large company has opened up access to these and made these interoperable. And some VC or some funder would come back and say, yeah, but what if they change it? And I said, that's okay. In Europe, they have invested not in ex-ante regulation, that's part of the DMA, but in reducing the cost for ex-post regulation to be able to handle that particular thing. It allows the incumbents to commit to staying open by basically enforcing that, which again can open up markets. So, but remember, it's where the incumbents have already decided to build the ecosystem, rather than the enforced ecosystem, that's going to be the merit from this act. Now, is that going to be enough in domains such as AI to counter some of the other effects of other regulation of AI? Well, the jury's still out on that. But I very much worry about any friction added to the innovation process. We've got to reduce frictions because they're very, very salient. And we've seen this with GDPR and other things. And finally, I just want to say, for God's sake, Europe, stop experimenting. Stop being the first. I'm sorry. You're a big place. You're a big place. Policy experiments belong in smaller countries. They should happen in Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain. Those are... being first it's just not... Please stop it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Conscious of time, so I'll just allow for one minute concluding remark. We knew it was a lot to cover, so yes, if anyone wants to say some final words.
No, you go.
Wrapping up a little bit on what has been said, because I think everything together makes quite a bit of sense. I think we've been giving all the messages. So I think it's a journey, and it's going to be a journey. So I think there is this date, right? The 7th of March is going to be the date, and everything will change, and probably that's a bit above expectations. There will be things that should be changing, because there will be adaptations of conducts, and that should be visible, and probably that we will be able to see. But the most important part is about all the things that Amelia and Fiona have been saying about imagining what will be possible, right? And I think, and that's what Olivia was saying. It's about opening new opportunities and giving the incentives for those that will be responsible to bring those opportunities forward to do it. And this will take time, and it will be, as any regulatory procedure, engaging constantly with the stakeholders in the industry and going back to the regulator and to the stakeholders and understanding how this has the power of transform the market. And just to say, indeed, I think it's very good to see that the principles across jurisdictions are similar. So basically, I guess this means that we are all together experimenting something new. So let's see where it brings us.
Yeah, and I just wanted to echo what Luis said. I think you heard from everyone on the panel a lot about innovation. And you asked me at the beginning, what is success of the DMA? Is it prices or quality or innovation? I think the answer is innovation. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. And in digital markets, that's a very appropriate goal, because in many of those markets, the money prices that consumers face are not really the greatest source of their benefit. It's really the fact that there are amazing new products and services that that get invented every year and make life better. So I think this is really the big goal.
And I guess I actually agree with Joshua that most of these businesses are going to be focused on innovating and not in coming and talking to the Commission. But I do think that when they hit blockages that they think seem unfair, they should be thinking of coming and speaking to the Commission and hopefully, and the CMA, and hopefully they will be more likely to now.
One minute and maybe two thoughts. So there's going to be a challenge. I think coming back to Joshua's point on the Europe stop experimenting, I understand the call, but I'm afraid it will not stop here. If you look at the legislative docket, it's huge. But there is an underlying issue, and I think is people and government in Europe, but also outside Europe, do not feel that they are in control of the process. And the way to express control is trying to get control through legislation. And maybe that is that's not going to be of much success, but we need the people to give the feeling of control over the process, control over their own lives. And that is an important challenge also for the enforcers. And given all these laws and all these enforcement agencies that are going to be involved, coordination among countries, but also enforcement agencies is of crucial importance. And that's why I think we in the Netherlands copied the Digital Regulators Forum concept in the UK. We see similar developments in other countries and also across Europe. It is extremely important that there is a coherent policy of digital regulation and digital enforcement to give that feeling of control back to people, because otherwise it will not stop and new legislation will pop up with new enforcement initiatives. And that is going to reduce innovation rather than encourage it.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel for this fantastic discussion.